This is History for the Reckoning, a podcast that dives deep into the history that's hard to hear but critical to understand. Season 1, American Concentration Camps, the story of World War II Japanese incarceration. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Ford. Last episode, Claudia Katayanagi told us about the many people of Japanese descent that were incarcerated within the United States that were not from the United States. They had been forcibly removed, stolen from South America, from Central America, many of them only speaking Spanish, and were confined in places like Crystal City, Texas. So today, I thought it'd be a special treat to play you one of their stories as they told it. So this is an oral history of one of these survivors of those camps, Libya Hideko Yamamoto, courtesy of the National Japanese American Historical Society, who have generously given me permission to play you this oral history on the podcast. So she's going to introduce herself in Spanish, and then she'll tell the rest of her story in English, and you'll find out why.
Me llamo Libia Hideko Maoki Yamamoto, de Yamamoto. Yo nací en Perú, en una hacienda que se llama Tumán, que es cerca de la ciudad de Chiclayo, en norte parte de Peru. I was born in the hacienda, and we call it Hacienda Tumán. I was born there, and I went to school during my first grade. And during that time, my sister was going to school in Chiclayo. The Japanese community had built a private school, and it was a boarding school, so my sister was going to that boarding school. And when the war broke out, I started going to the city school. It's funny to me because we were very assimilated. My parents felt that we should even adopt the, I don't know that he himself was a Buddhist in Japan. My mother was a Buddhist, but he felt very strongly that we should try to even go into the Catholic religion. So my sister and I went through the First Communion. We attended Catholic school, church. And even in our school, we had a place, a little open chapel with the statue of Mary and with Jesus, and I remember the cross. And so we recited the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. We did these things. And to me, it's really, it's almost ridiculous that they had so much fear just because we looked a little different and we spoke a different language. It was January 6th, 1943, at night, that a detective came to our home in the hacienda and took my father to jail. It was late at night, and I was in the city of Chiclayo. The next morning, my mother came to Chiclayo, and there was a lot of buzzing around, and everybody was so busy making lunch, making food, preparing food. I was asking everybody what's going on, but everybody was so busy, And then I remember when we all gathered at a corner, and approximately 20 men were put into a truck, and we were saying goodbye to them, And I said, where are they going? And nobody could tell me. We didn't know where they were being taken. And the mothers were trying to restrain from crying. And I remember they got onto that truck. And before they went on their truck, one of the things that the Japanese people do in time of victory or in time of celebration as well, they have their hail. They say banzai. And they said banzai, and they started singing, and they left. And then the mothers were, sobbing, and it was just, and then I found out that we didn't know where he was going or if we would ever see him again. So then it really struck me. I remember that day very well. About a month later, we received a letter from my father. Actually, the letter was a birthday card to my sister. Her birthday was February 13. And he hadn't forgotten. He wrote to her, and he said that he was in a camp in Panama. We were told that we were to leave in July of 1943. As far as the business was concerned, I understand my father had told my mother to give one of the employees a power of attorney in case of anything. But there was really nothing much that they could do. I think she tried to sell some of the machinery that they had, but whether she was able to do that or not, I don't know. There was not too much time. Eventually it was confiscated. He lost a bakery. I remember my dad telling me that he lost a bakery. His friend who had the power of attorney couldn't do anything. The government just did not acknowledge, I guess, the power of attorney. I remember my mother said, take one thing that you want, and I picked up that doll. It was a doll that my dad had given me when I was very sick. I was 3 years old when I became very ill, and he had brought it to me from Lima. And I remember that doll. That's all I wanted. All I remember of the whole deportation is that we were on a ship, and there were about 8 of us in this small cabin, bunk beds, and hardly any room, maybe about 4 feet by 6 feet of space between, in the middle of this cabin where we could change and things. There were about 8 of us and a little round porthole. I don't remember the kind of food that was being served at all, but I do remember that when we went into the Panama Canal, we started looking out the portholes, and the soldiers who were guarding the ship, and we were always under the guard, of the soldiers. They came around and closed the portholes, so we couldn't see very much anymore. And then after we left Panama, we ran into a real bad Caribbean storm, and everybody got seasick. And that morning, the only people in the mess hall was my mother, this very sickly lady, and I. Everybody else was sick. It didn't take me very long to have to rush to my cabin. As soon as I started eating, I couldn't hang on to it. When we arrived in New Orleans, that's where we landed. I remember we had to get inspection. We had to go through inspection of our personal properties. And I remember having to watch our property, our trunks. I don't know where my mother was going, but most of these people that were on the ship were mothers and children. And I was told to watch my trunk as I watched other people go through their inspection. I remember seeing things, these inspectors taking things out of their suitcases and trunks and throwing them overboard. And I remember the cartons and things floating on the water. And I was fearful that the inspector was going to take I was able to bring one thing that I liked, and that was a doll. And I was afraid that he was going to take my doll and throw it overboard. But fortunately he didn't. After we arrived in New Orleans, we stayed there for a few days, as I recall. We were put in this great big building with rows of cots, and I think we were there 2 nights, and then we were put on a train and went to San Antonio, Texas. After we got to San Antonio, they put us on a truck, and we went to Crystal City, where the camp was. And I don't remember how long after we arrived there. I think it was almost a month. My dad arrived, and all the men arrived from the camp that they were in, which was Kennedy, Texas. So that's when we were reunited. It's a happy day. He looked much thinner. He looked like he had been working hard. He was a little more tanned than I recalled. He still had his mustache, but I was so happy to see him. When he was gone, they were put to hard labor when he was in the Panama camp, in the Panama Canal zone, interned there. They were taken from Panama and shipped over to California, San Pedro. And from there they were put on a train and taken to Texas, to Kennedy. I recall my friends who came subsequent to us in 1944. They came about 8 months later. I remember one of the girls saying that they were processed and they were stripped and having to take a mass shower and then sprayed with DDT. We had none of that. I recall, though, I guess this was after we arrived in camp, that we had to go through the smallpox vaccination. And we were all lined up for that, I recall that. But I remember seeing these cabins. They were bare. I mean, it was just a bare ground and these little cabins lined up. And in a way, I think my heart kind of sank. I thought, oh, we're going to live in this kind of a place. And at first we thought we had the whole cabin, Then we found out that we only have one side of the cabin, which was one big room. And then we had, in between the two rooms in one cabin, was a little toilet and a basin. And that was a connecting, the toilet was a connecting room between the two. We had to share that one. And as far as the taking shower and things like that, we had to go to the community bathhouse, which was shared by about 80 families. We had showers there, open shower stalls, and we had laundry room where we had that big tub we could do our wash. They also had the scrub board. That was another building altogether. For some people, it was like walking a block to get to the bathhouse. It was hot through August, and in the winter we had snow. That first winter, we got all excited because it was the first time we had seen snow. We took our little housewares they gave us. We had a little pot and little bowls. We would take the bowl out so that it'll accumulate snow, and we would have that. That was a real treat for us. Sprinkle a little bit of sugar. We had snow cone, real snow cone. We had to go to mess hall to eat our meals at first. I remember getting into lines and having a plate. I don't remember what we ate, but I was not impressed. I think it might have been 4 or 5 months before they started giving us allotment of cardboard money, different color coins, cardboard coins. Some were red, some were green, some were blue. They gave us allotment according to the number in the family for food, mainly for food and toiletries. And then families were allowed to go to the grocery store with this money and buy the groceries that we needed and cook ourselves. The camp itself was surrounded by barbed wire fence and guard towers. We had guard towers with soldiers and machine guns facing not outside but into the camp, so that we were cautioned not to go too close to the fence. But once a year, we were permitted to go out of the camp and go on a picnic. Of 2,600 Japanese Latin Americans that were deported, and in turn 1,800 were from Peru. This number really indicates that Peru wanted to get rid of the Japanese people. There was a big riot in 1940, and the Peruvian government probably took this opportunity. They thought there was a great opportunity to get rid of all the Japanese people, sort of like ethnic cleansing, And so 1,800 were from Peru, and they were all interned in Department of Justice, Immigration and Naturalization Service camps. I understand there were 27 camps that were under the jurisdiction of the INS. I only know about 5 of them, one in Missoula, Montana, one in Kuski, Idaho, and there was one in Seagoville, Texas, Kennedy, Texas, Crystal City, Texas, the largest family camp, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm not familiar with the others, but these interned Latin American Japanese were interned in these camps. And as I mentioned, the largest of them being Crystal City. Most of us were in that camp. There were a lot of Japanese American in there too that had come from other camps, as well as from Hawaii. These were Japanese civic leaders, like Buddhist priests, Japanese school teachers, Japanese paper editors, lawyers, doctors, and they were sent to our camp. So we had Japanese Americans, but we also had Germans and Italians. I believe about 900 Germans and Italians were in our camp. We, from Peru, went to Japanese school. We learned the Japanese etiquettes, songs, reading, writing. The Japanese Americans did attend English school. They were separate from us. They had their own classes and they learned everything in English. We learned everything in Japanese. We spoke Spanish among ourselves, and especially because we didn't know how to speak English. And whenever we were confronted by Germans, we usually talked to them in Spanish. And there were 554 Japanese Peruvians that were sent to Japan as prisoner exchange in two shiploads in 1942 and in 1943. I remember when the war ended, there was a lot of buzzing and a lot of, relief, sigh of relief, and yet there was a lot of anticipation also because we didn't know what was going to happen. Why didn't my family go back to Peru? Well, when the war ended, the U.S. government said that we were illegal aliens, even though it was the government that brought us without passport, and they confiscated the passports that my parents had, and they did not give us any visas or anything like this. The Peruvian government would not take us back. The Peruvian government said, no, you can't come back. And in 1946, the government said that if we found sponsors, that we could leave the camp. Well, there was a food processing plant in New Jersey that said they needed cheap labor, and they said they would sponsor a group of people if the government could send them cheap labor. And so about 200 of our people that remained in camp went to Seabrook, New Jersey. And the remaining 160 of us, we tried to find other means of getting out of camp. So we stayed even after 1946. We came out of camp, it had been many years, 4 years since I had ridden in an automobile. But they came to escort us out of camp in an automobile, and they took us to this town called Uvalde, I think, and that's where we had to wait for the train. And we took the train to Los Angeles, stayed there for a few days, and then took the train to Berkeley, California, and this is where we settled in Berkeley. I just want to add that the camp experience did bring a lot of us together, even though many of the older ones, the older children as well as our parents, did suffer a great deal, a lot of humiliation. The very essence of living is that we make the most of the situation and never be defeated. That has carried me through. And I think that's what it carried my parents through, their attitude, their philosophy, of doing the best that you can no matter what the circumstance, and look to things in a positive way. And that has carried us through.
Season 1 of History for the Reckoning is made possible by support from the JACL Mount Olympus chapter, as well as generous financial support from the Takahashi Family Foundation and the JA Community Foundation. The music was produced by Patrick Coffin. If you want to support the show, follow us on Instagram at History for the Reckoning. Sign up for our newsletter at History for the Reckoning on Substack, where you'll also find the show notes for each episode, or support us financially through Patreon at patreon.com/historyforthereckoning.